Have you ever faced any challenges when you were looking to grow in your career, to progress to more senior leadership positions?
Yeah, I think the challenge, as I've mentioned, the challenges of racism, where oftentimes I'm at tables where I'm the only one that's
Mm,
a person of color or a Black person. And that could be a very hard space to hold, whether it's intentional or unconscious bias, people sort of reacting in a way. I can give you concrete examples. Sometimes I'm at these tables or have been at tables throughout my career where we're talking about specific issues. I would make a point about an issue, bringing forward a solution. I might get the typical kind of head nods like, okay, interestingly, that's an interesting comment. And then I'm telling you, in the space of the same meetings, like 20 minutes later, someone, reframes that same thought and puts it forward. And it becomes like, wow, this is the greatest idea since sliced bread, right? So those are the types of microaggressions and racism that I've experienced in my career, where it's like my opinion is not valid, or when I speak, I'm only speaking on behalf of the Black women in Toronto, which I could never pretend to even know or understand that very diverse group of people in Toronto. It almost seems like people expect me to be the health equity champion, which I am, right, in many cases, but they expect me to kind of be introducing ideas of how to be more equitable in how we're doing our work, or how to address populations who have the barriers, which is what I do. But at the same time, I would expect that I would have many more allies around the table who can also speak to the issues just as well as I can, because they're trying to support better health outcomes for everybody, not just specific populations. So I think racism has been my biggest barrier. People who think that maybe I don't belong there, or my voice doesn't matter, or they just don't appreciate the perspective I bring to the table. So it's something that I constantly work at in terms of my own self-care, in terms of making sure that that doesn't impact my sense of self, or who I am, or me giving voice to an issue, because I think in spite of that, I need to continue to rise to the challenge, because it's important for me to be also a good mentor and role model for other, young Black women who may aspire to be in leadership down the road. And like the women before me who have blazed the trail so that I could sit at the tables where I sit, I feel that I owe it to my community, to my family, my children, and myself to just continue to blaze that trail forward, so that at the end of the day, everybody has a place at the table. Doesn't matter what walk of life you come from, whether you're part of the Black community, whether you're a woman, whether you're LGBT, person with disabilities, it doesn't really matter.
Yes, I'm waiting for that day, when it doesn't matter how you look or where you come from, we're all the same. Yeah. Do you feel even today the issue with racism is it a lot better than previously, or, where are we?
Well, unfortunately, I don't see much advancement here in terms of broader society. We still have issues with, Black people being targeted, to the extent where that targeting results in, loss of life, people being murdered. I mean, the obvious case that shined a light on this recently is the George Floyd situation. And I think, unfortunately, even since George Floyd, before George Floyd and after George Floyd, that experience continues for Black people, young Black men particularly, feeling targeted and by police, and being shot and killed and murdered for no reason at all other than they're Black. So I don't think that we have progressed much here in this area. It's something that I'm constantly working on with other allies in the community, to finally get to the point where we can understand anti-Black racism exists, and we can understand that it exists in our structures, like in our systems, in our policies, and begin that whole process of unpacking that and implementing policies that are more inclusive. So I work at that constantly. It's not just anti-Black racism, it's anti-Asian racism, it's anti-Indigenous racism. So I'm not someone that's necessarily only working to change the system only because of who I am, but I see those inequities across many other communities as well. And so I'm constantly championing that. I have to say, some days I have more energy for it than other days, right? Because it's an issue that's near and dear to my heart. It affects my own life. It affects my children, my family. So it's very close to me. However, I still managed to, kind of wake up the next day and carry on and figure out how can we address this, trying to work individually too with my peer colleagues, right? I have many peer colleagues who are white people who are really great allies, I'm happy to say. So, having them support and champion the cause around anti-Black racism and dealing with systemic barriers for all people who are disadvantaged are something that, they also take really seriously and try to weigh in wherever possible on this. But, to your point, Shiyen, we have a lot of work to do as a global community on this front. Mm-hmm. And I guess, I live in that hope where, yes, all people are equal and should be treated equally and should be provided equal opportunities to advance in our society. But the reality is, I know we still have quite a way to go on this front. And, I guess it's just part of my life work in terms of changing that around for our generations to come.
Yeah, and I'm with you on that. It's something very close to my heart as well. So totally support everything that you're doing. And, when we look at diversity, if we're looking at healthcare specifically and, leadership in healthcare, you've said that sometimes you're the only person of color or, the only Black person there at the table. How can we improve diversity in, if we're talking just about healthcare leadership, how can we improve it there? Because a lot of our frontline staff are, of minority origin, of other cultures, ethnicities, LGBT, etc. Yeah.
Well, I feel like we have to be intentional about it, right? So if we know the current state, like when I show up in a room, I look around, I'm like, okay, there's only one of me, right? I feel like that speaks volumes, right? And it should say to our institutions, our healthcare institutions, let's, go back and look at, our recruitment strategies. Let's look at the strategy around how people progress in our organization. So it's really looking at your workforce strategy, doing some workforce planning, but making sure that representation, diversity is represented at all levels of the organization, right? So to your point, very, very common for diversity to be reflected in very frontline positions. And, in broader society, we see that diversity being reflected in the essential workers, right? So, the factory workers, the people working in the grocery stores, people working in companies I won't name or mention are the racialized workers. But the higher you go up in the ranks within those organizations, that's not the case. And in a situation where, like the one we're in a pandemic, we're seeing some of those communities, the racialized people, being hardest hit around, contracting COVID and dealing with unfortunate deaths and very poor outcomes as it relates to COVID. So I think it's really at organizational level that we start looking at ourselves as an organization, asking ourselves some critical questions, doing some internal workforce census so we understand the demographic makeup of our workforce and where there's some gaps, and then, sort of deal with coming up with a strategy to address those gaps. People sometimes tell me, I hear it all the time, oh, well, we don't really know. There's no qualified Black people who could be in leadership roles. And I say, well, where are you looking? I see them all the time. They're all around me. And there are people there with great talent. Like, I'm not necessarily even a proponent that you're hiring for diversity only. I think that you're hiring for diversity and you're hiring a top candidate, you know, who has the skills, the qualification, the ability to fulfill the role. But I think we have to put in a little bit more time and be more strategic around how we reach out, when we're looking to fill some of these roles. And I tell people, there are people out there who you could take on, maybe as a mentor, mentee, or people that you could sponsor. So maybe they don't have necessarily the whole basket of skills to be the hospital CEO. But, right, if you give it the time of day to, sponsor that person or mentor them into that role, where you're actually, translating some of your knowledge, that would be a phenomenal thing. And, it's not just in healthcare leadership, but also at the governance level, right? That we see this gap where we don't see many racialized people at the governance level, which is what prompted me very recently to, enroll in another education program where I'm looking forward to getting a designation as an international corporate director through the Rotman School of Management, just learning all about, good governance practice across many different sectors. So not just healthcare, but private sector, family-owned businesses, et cetera.